This is chapter 12, where we will be discussing family as a social institution. This was the first of what will be four videos. The first video is kind of introducing a lot of our main terminology related to this chapter, and the second video is talking about changes and shifts to the family over time. And then the third and fourth video are going to be providing an overview of some of the major shifts in family structure we have seen in contemporary society. So, before we actually get into the discussion of family, just a reminder of what social institutions are and the role that they play in your life. So, members of every society create and maintain social institutions as a way of controlling human behavior, which is why social institutions were part of the social structure chapter. And the whole purpose here is it's how we meet our basic needs as a society. And what are the basic needs of society? They need to regulate reproduction, socialize, protect children, transmit knowledge and skills, produce and distribute goods and services, allocate power, maintain social environment, protect the society from its enemies. And so all of these social institutions is what we've created as a society to address these needs. And they often interact with one another and build upon one another. So in that way that they are interdependent. But then sometimes they also can be in conflict with one another in terms of the kind of underlying beliefs and values and norms that can exist in one social institution, but might look very different in another social institution. And so, if you look at your chapter, all the material that we could not cover due to time, most of those chapters are related to these social institutions. And so, the one social institution that we will be specifically covering, largely because it relates so closely to the chapter that we just finished, gender, is the institution of family. So, as I indicated, social institutions fill the basic needs of society. So, the question here is, why do we have families? Well, a couple of things. First of all, this is how we reproduce our communities and citizenry, right? This is kind of how society manages its reproduction. We know that children are born within families. And then those children, families are responsible for socializing them and transmitting the culture, teaching them the necessary norms, values, and beliefs in order for them to kind of be culturally aware, culturally conscious citizens. But it's not just the young of the society that families care for. Families also provide care much beyond what the government could ever provide or what the private sector could ever provide to the elderly as well. So whether you are helping grandma drive to the grocery store, or if you're safety proofing the home, if you're visiting, making sure that bills are being paid or sufficient food is in the cabinets, in the same way that families provide care for the young, they provide care for the old. Families contribute to the economy as consumers. We know that there are some things that people just are more likely to buy, or they buy more of when they are in a family household versus an individual household. This could be everything from homes to multiple cars to food, especially food in bulk. So places like Costco and Sam's Club, it really is families that fuel those types of retailers, much more so than individuals. And then, of course, families help us allocate social roles. It helps us kind of know, what to expect of a mother or a father or a older sibling. And these social roles can change. They can be fluid over time, which we'll talk about. But certainly, we learn about these roles, and we are assigned these roles within the structure of family. So let's start by, distinguishing between the Census Bureau definition of family and then the kind of Census Bureau definition of a household, which isn't the same thing. A family is a specific type of household. A household is just all people who occupy a housing unit. So this would be individual households, households where there's only one person, but this also would be households that don't meet the census definition of family, which is a group of two people or more related by birth, marriage, or adoption who reside together. And in sociology, we sometimes, indicate that this definition leaves people out, that this doesn't perfectly describe all the people that we think of as being family. And we'll talk about that more in the upcoming slide. But this idea that it is two people or more and they're related by birth, marriage, or adoption is kind of further encapsulated by the concept of nuclear family, which is that traditional family style of two married adults that have dependent children. And what we have kind of idealized in our heads is that most of us will go from being in a nuclear family we are born into, which is what we call the family of origin, or if you are adopted, there's the family you're born into and then the family you're raised in, which is the family of orientation. But we will go from this nuclear family to, as we get older and meet someone and then get married and then have children of our own, then we will go into our second nuclear family of our lifetime, which is our family of procreation. And so for like the last 100 or so years, or up until contemporary society, we kind of imagined that people would live these lives that kind of bookmarked by these two nuclear families. And that when we talk about family, this is who most of us maybe are assuming people are referring to. But this isn't everyone who is family. So certainly there are two other types of family members that we can think of. We can think of extended family. This would be people like your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, right? They're not part of your nuclear family, but they are related to you by birth. And then we have affiliated kin, and these are people who are, not necessarily related by blood, but are related by marriage. So, if you have in-laws, mother-in-law, father-in-law, sister-in-law, brother-in-law, if people in your family have gotten divorced and remarried, and now you have step-siblings, step-parents, step-grandparents, maybe even, if you have half, right? You have, siblings that, you share one parent but not both. All of that is what we call affiliated kin. And the final kind of term that's not on the slide, but I would like to add to that is this concept of fictive kin. These are people that are not actually related to you by blood or by marriage or adoption, but they feel as if they're related to you. So this could be the best friend who's like a brother, or your best friend's mom who's like a second mother. If you, have godparents that aren't related to you in any other way besides them being your godparents, then godparents would be a good example of people who we call fictive kin. And so the fact that people have these people in their lives that go beyond their nuclear family structure is part of the reason why the sociology definition of family is a little bit broader and more expanded. A group of people who identify themselves as being related to one another. And although we do acknowledge that usually this is because of blood, marriage, or adoption, the key thing here is that you identify the person as being a family member. And usually what makes them family to you is this: you share intimacy, you care about one another, as well as dependency. You depend upon one another. And so this means that we can sometimes, as sociologists, measure people as family that certainly don't meet that Census Bureau definition of family. And so I give some examples here. Same-sex couple with adopted children. It's worth noting, before we had the federal recognition of same-sex couples, of same-sex marriages, they were not recognized as families on this census. Now, of course, if you're a same-sex couple and you're married, you're seen as any other family with the census definition. What about if you're a childless cohabiting couple? Well, for all intents and purposes, you're no different than being roommates of the opposite sex or same sex. according to the Census Bureau definition, they would not see you as a family even if you cohabit for years. But obviously, sociologists would. Foster parents with foster children. This is tricky because although we recognize adoptive parents and adopted children as families, Census Bureau does not necessarily recognize foster parents of foster children because they are in less stable, permanent kind of relationships, fixed relationships. They do not recognize them as being family. In sociology, we leave it up to you. If you were fostered and you consider your foster parents family, then we do as well in our research. If you don't consider them family, we would not necessarily force that definition upon you. Elderly siblings who reside together, yes, still family. Sometimes people forget that, the sibling parts of nuclear family is still key. So if you wind up living with your sibling when you're in your, 70s and 80s, you still would meet that census and sociological definition of family. And finally, roommates, which is a tricky one because it kind of depends on the type of roommate you are. For the census, you are not considered to be family if you're roommates. But for sociologists, it has a lot to do with, do you meet the criteria of caring about one another and being interdependent? So, if you're somewhere, sending your roommate passive aggressive text and only communicating when the bills are due and writing your name on the orange juice, then of course we wouldn't consider you to be family. But if you're more like, the roommates that existed on the TV show Friends, then you would certainly meet the kind of sociological definition of family in that case. Now, a big part of the nuclear family definition is around that two married adults, whether it's your family of origin or your family of procreation. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about marriage. So, marriage is the legally recognized union between two people in which they are united sexually, cooperate economically, and may give birth to, adopt, or rear children. It is the primary socially approved mating relationship, and people expect it to be stable and enduring. And it's worth noting that research suggests that even though we have, high divorce rates, we have increasing number of people, getting prenuptial agreements before they enter into marriage, and we are starting to see more and more people being interested in open marriages or polyamory. For a lot of people, that kind of basic definition of marriage still exists. They expect it to be stable, they expect it to be enduring. And these recent trends, even when they are aware of them, usually don't really impact their own kind of personal views and expectations for their own marriage. And when you think about why do people marry, nowadays a lot of it does have to do with the role of love, which is fairly new. Like this is something that kind of comes out of the early 1900s, 1920s. Before that, across most cultures, most people married for financial stability purposes, for purposes related to solidifying financial standing or social standing. The idea of marrying for love was seen as very flighty and superficial. Instead, love was seen as something that would grow over time. Now, of course, even if people appreciate and are aware of the fact that there is financial stability in getting married, most people don't list that as that primary reason as to why they're getting married. And we'll talk about that more in upcoming presentations. And so, similar to how the reasons for getting married have changed, so has the age at first marriage. You might note there that women have consistently always been younger than men at their first marriage. And this has a lot to do with the fact that even in earlier times, men were expected to be financially stable, able to support a family before they got married, which required them to be a little older, while women, especially pre-1970s, were largely just expected to be able to reproduce. And so they married at much earlier ages than men. after 1970, with the increase of women in education and professions, you see that there has been a dramatic increase in the age of first marriage for women and men. Although women are still a little younger than men, when they first get married, that gap has dramatically decreased, and both men and women are waiting longer to get married as they focus on gaining education and careers and financial stability. So in 2016, that was kind of our smallest percentage of 20 to 24-year-olds who are married than we've ever had in previous decades. Only 7% of men and only 12% of women between the ages of 20 to 24 were married. And so before we leave marriage behind, as well as the end of this first presentation, kind of the other expectation, of course, and actual the requirement of marriage in America is that it's monogamous. It's one spouse at one time. Other cultures, other countries practice polygamy, and there have been times in this country where we've had groups that were polygamous in nature, where they have more than one marital partner at a time, but law pretty much dictates now you only have one spouse at a time. Now, with the fairly high divorce rate, what we are starting to see as being a more common practice, and we'll talk about this more in presentation in video 3, is Americans practicing serial monogamy. You have more than one wife or husband over your lifetime, but you only have one at a time, right? So you get married, and then at some point you get divorced, and then at some point you get remarried. And this has become an increasingly more common trend. And so that is it for the first presentation. Second presentation is just kind of discuss marriage and family over time, offer a little bit more details about some of the things that I lightly touched on in this presentation.